Timekeepers. The sacred timeline. Who actually believes this bunkum?
Ticket, sir.
Was He Who Remains influencing our main MCU timeline the whole time? If his goal was to keep the sacred timeline intact, did he slowly tweak everything we've seen so far in order to stop the looming multiversal war?
Because I already know what's going to happen.
What huge events could he have been responsible for, and what would have happened if things went differently? Let's discuss.
No, you can't get to the end until you've been changed by the journey. This stuff, it needs to happen.
So in the MCU, the multiverse is beginning to crack. Slowly and surely throughout Phase 4, we've seen the multiverse making itself known, with an emphasis in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, Spider-Man No Way Home, and especially Loki. It's in that Disney Plus show that basically set up the entire Multiverse Saga. The finale saw the introduction of He Who Remains, who gave a fantastic monologue where he stared directly into the camera and said, "Audiences, listen up. This is what the MCU is going to be for the next few years."
Creepy. Right.
I mean, yeah, he didn't really do it like that, but it felt like it. Anyways, we learned that He Who Remains was adamant about protecting the sacred timeline in order to stop a full-blown multiversal war. Though doing that for so long was tiring, and Miss Minutes wouldn't share her Netflix password with him, so he got bored. That's why he was more than happy to let Sylvie drive her knife directly into his chest. And immediately we got to see the sacred timeline start to branch and spin out of control, setting the stage for Kang the Conqueror to make his grand entrance in a later film. And while the future is a little frightening, I mean, have you seen Kang? He's ripped. I want to talk a little bit about the past. What does it mean if we say He Who Remains spent his time protecting the sacred timeline? Yes, it involves using the TVA to prune variants, but has there been tampering with events to ensure that multiversal war never happens? Has He Who Remains completely changed the course of history by editing key moments in the MCU that better protect the future? The reason I think this is an interesting concept is because it allows an opportunity for Marvel Studios to provide a reason for all of its big changes it made from the comic source material. No, I'm not saying the MCU had a plan the whole time or anything, but this just gives them a chance to tie the past and the future together as they lean more toward comic accuracy in the future. Let me explain what I mean a bit by using the X-Men as an example. So before the Loki finale, there were no mutants in the MCU. Why is that? Obviously, we all know the real reason is because Marvel Studios didn't have the rights to the X-Men. But what if the MCU can now give a better in-universe reason for their absence? What if our timeline was supposed to have mutants in it from the start, but their presence eventually would lead to Kang the Conqueror and multiversal war, so He Who Remains successfully removed them from our timeline? And I don't think that is such a preposterous idea, given Kang's history with one of the first mutants in Marvel Comics. That's right, I'm talking about Apocalypse. In the comics, Kang the Conqueror travels back in time, assumes the identity of the pharaoh Rama-Tut, and starts manipulating the young Apocalypse to try to get him on his side. His plans are foiled, but using that as the basis, you can start to see how that would have unfolded in the MCU. What if He Who Remains knew how this would play out, maybe by seeing it happen in another universe, and worked to fix it in our timeline? Maybe he removed Apocalypse altogether, thus eliminating Kang's reason for traveling back to that era. This had the ripple effect of getting rid of mutants completely in the MCU going forward. This leads us to right now. I thought for a long time that the easiest way to introduce mutants into the MCU would be to just put them in a different universe and then have them cross over to ours. I believed that was the cleanest way to do things. But now that plan obviously isn't happening, and I struggled for a while thinking why it was happening the way it was. It was a big deal to announce at the end of Miss Marvel that Kamala was a mutant.
Like a mutation.
And if it wasn't clear that she was being called a mutant, they even played the 90s X-Men theme over that scene. And more recently, in Wakanda Forever, Namor says that his winged feet are a mutation. Why are mutants suddenly making themselves known now? What changed? Well, He Who Remains got a big knife to the chest. Maybe his death allows for a soft reboot of our timeline where mutants were slowly always present. If you're a Doctor Who fan, then you know that the timeline is often timey timey-wimey and a bit rubbery. Maybe He Who Remains' death is causing a ripple effect that allows the MCU to say the mutants have been here the whole time, but also explain why they didn't help out in big events or why they're just showing up now.
Don't do that!
And if we apply this theory to other parts of the MCU, then you can start to see a very interesting pattern emerge. That brings me to Infinity War and Endgame. Could my theory regarding He Who Remains changing key moments in the MCU so they weren't as comic accurate and therefore preventing multiversal war apply to the end of Phase 3? I actually think yes it could. Obviously, I think the 1-2 punch of Infinity War and Endgame was brilliant, but it was very different from the comics. Does the MCU now have a good reason for that? That they can now make canon? Again, I absolutely understand that movies will always be different from comics, and it's oftentimes better, but I just think this is a good opportunity to provide a stronger connection between the films and the comics in a way that's never been done before. What if our timeline was supposed to have the original Infinity Gauntlet comic storyline, but He Who Remains tweaked it? Let's examine what that would look like. Thanos in the comics was obsessed with death. His whole goal of collecting all the Infinity Gems was to court death and basically impress her. He was just a boy who liked a girl and wanted her to notice him. Isn't that romantic? And I'm saying that comic accurate motivation could have been the original idea, but He Who Remains saw that it ended with multiversal war and tweaked it. What if He Who Remains was the one who made it so Titan destroyed itself and ran out of resources, knowing that it would spark Thanos into action earlier than originally planned, and thus changing the timeline? It seems like from what we saw in Endgame, Thanos' motivations weren't as complex as Infinity War made them out to be. Infinity War made it seem like Thanos thought himself as the universe's protector, making the tough sacrifices in order to ultimately save the entire universe from itself. But Endgame sort of showed us that really Thanos was just another madman, wanting to remake the universe in his own image. So it seems like Thanos very easily could have had his love affair with death in the future if Titan didn't destroy itself earlier on. So the question with that becomes, why did He Who Remains alter this? What benefit does that serve? Well, there's a few things here that we could discuss, and the big one is Tony Stark's role. I've discussed recently in another video how Tony Stark needed to die in Endgame. If he didn't, then he would go on to become one of the biggest villains in the entire multiverse by jump-starting the multiversal war. That idea makes even more sense if you apply the idea of He Who Remains altering things to protect the sacred timeline. If Tony had survived Endgame and lived to this new multiverse era, knowing his personality, we can assume he would have pushed the limits to explore the multiverse further, and that could have led to Kang taking over in the future. If changing the original MCU timeline by changing Thanos' character motivation led us to the moment where Tony Stark sacrificed himself to help keep the sacred timeline intact, then that would be a fascinating idea. Plus, it sort of makes sense.
We're talking about time travel here. Either it's all a joke or none of it is.
In Infinity War, Doctor Strange sees all possible futures and finds there is literally only one way in over 14 million scenarios that the Avengers win and stop Thanos. But also, doesn't that sound odd? For one thing, 14 million ways to failure seems like a statistical improbability. And also, with the idea of the multiverse being infinite, Strange should have kept going because by definition, there should have been more than one way to win. But if you frame it as He Who Remains doing timeline shenanigans, making it an absolute certainty that Tony had to die in Endgame, then all of that makes more sense. Then we can say that there was only one way to beat Thanos because He Who Remains designed it that way. And really, you could trace back every major change from the comics to the movies to He Who Remains. Maybe He Who Remains altered the timeline to have Tony invent Ultron instead of Hank Pym. Why? Well, maybe Hank would have invented Ultron in order to rescue Janet from the quantum realm, and that would have led to Kang getting out even sooner. Or you could argue that if he didn't invent Ultron and have it fail, then Tony would have had another passion project that would have led to the discovery of the multiverse and caused a whole mess of trouble for everyone.
That wasn't supposed to happen, was it?
Oh, we blew it.
I think there's a lot of different directions you could take this theory and still have it fit within the MCU's established canon while providing a reason why the MCU is so different than the comics. So all of this video so far has been dealing with events in the past and how He Who Remained tweaked them away from comic accuracy to prevent multiversal war. But now let's talk about present day Phase 4 as well as the future. Can this theory apply to what's been happening in Phase 4? I think so, actually. I've been discussing He Who Remained changing of the timeline, but now that he's dead, the timeline will start reverting back to something more in line with the comics. I've already discussed the mutants being slowly introduced after He Who Remains' death, but what about other characters? There's two characters in Phase 4 that I specifically want to talk about, who in Phase 4 went through dramatic transformations after He Who Remains' death that inched them closer to something more comic accurate. And that would be Scarlet Witch and Spider-Man. Let's start with Scarlet Witch. Phase 4 wasn't necessarily the kindest to Wanda. I mean, I guess neither was Phase 2, or Phase 3 for that matter. Wow, Wanda's had it pretty tough. But Phase 4 took a radical shift with Wanda's character that people are still discussing whether it was a good choice or not. I, of course, am talking about her heel turn and descent into villainy in Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. I've seen so many think pieces and opinions regarding the idea that the end of WandaVision doesn't accurately set up her role in Doctor Strange. The end of WandaVision is more or less a little hopeful. Wanda stops Agatha, seemingly learns her lesson, and is essentially forgiven for her crimes in a way that was a little odd. Monica Rambeau tells her that the people of the town will never know what she sacrificed, and then just lets her walk away, and didn't really feel like they were setting up Wanda for villainy. But then of course Doctor Strange happened, and we saw Wanda launch over the point of no return when she took out a lot of Wong's sorcerers and then turned Mr. Fantastic into spaghetti. So what happened in between WandaVision and Multiverse of Madness that would provide a better reason for the heel turn? Well, Loki happened. He Who Remained died, which left Wanda in a more vulnerable state. I mean, if He Who Remained was altering characters, maybe he was altering Wanda's destiny by keeping her from going evil. Because what happened when Wanda went evil? She went on a multiversal hunt to replace the ones she loved. Maybe He Who Remains saw this as a potential opening for Kang and influenced things where Wanda stayed on the side of good. But as soon as He Who Remains died, the floodgates opened and Wanda started looking for ways to punch holes in the universe. Again, not saying this was actually intentional, but it would be a way for the MCU to better explain Wanda's descent into crazy bad guy levels by showing that she would have snapped much earlier and embraced her comic roots sooner if He Who Remains wasn't around to protect the timeline. Spider-Man is the other character I want to talk about. He's in a similar situation as Wanda. As soon as He Who Remains dies, Peter gets involved in a huge multiversal adventure, but he also undergoes a pretty significant character shift. Since Civil War, it's been pretty unanimous that Tom Holland has made an excellent Peter Parker and Spider-Man, with his movies being solid Spidey adventures, but if there's one thing that was criticized, it was the tweaking of Peter's backstory. Instead of being the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man who lost his uncle in a tragic accident that spurred his sense of responsibility, Peter fell in with Iron Man and to a lot of people became Iron Man Jr. Now obviously, again, the real world reason for this was just because we had seen 2 Spider-Man origins already, so they wanted to skip over that for the 3rd time. But now they could have a better in-universe reason for it. What if Peter's comic accurate timeline led him to the multiverse faster? It's not out of the realm of possibility. The Spider-Verse is a very famous story that the MCU's Peter could have easily been a part of, but now what if He Who Remains altered the timeline to move Peter away from that completely? That might sound like a bit of a stretch, but again, look at what happens after He Who Remains dies. You could argue the timeline course corrects itself in No Way Home by pushing Peter toward a more comic accurate version of the character. He loses his close relative who tells him with great power comes great responsibility. He ditches his Tony Stark suit and makes his own makeshift one. He becomes a more street level, grounded hero, and he even gets a dose of the classic comic Peter luck when he has to lose his best friend and his true love to keep them safe. And that's the big things that have happened in Phase 4, so the final point to discuss is the future in Phase 5 and Phase 6. How will the timeline course correct itself in future MCU projects? Well, honestly, in a lot of small ways. Let's list a few of them right now. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 will feature Adam Warlock in a pretty sizable role, which is great because you could say the timeline was supposed to have Adam Warlock in the Infinity Gauntlet storyline, and now the universe is altering things to introduce introduce him into the story. Daredevil is being born again in his new television show, and instead of just saying the Netflix era takes place in a different universe, they could soft reboot it with much of the same cast and say that it's some He Who Remains meddling that allows Daredevil to be in our universe. And even Deadpool's upcoming Wolverine buddy comedy could be a course correction. I mean, if you were He Who Remains, wouldn't you keep Deadpool out of your sacred timeline? I know I would. These are all additional little examples, but I hope overall my broad point about He Who Remains altering the timeline makes sense. If so, let me know if you agree in the comments. If you disagree, well, go ahead and tear me apart in the comments as well. I know this theory isn't perfect and could use a little work, but I do think it has some merits. But do you think that too? Are there any other changes He Who Remains could have made to the MCU timeline that I didn't discuss here? What other changes do you think we'll see in the future? Again, is this even a viable theory, or is it too much of a reach? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching CBR. See you next time.